When ASEAN was established in 1967, one of its long-term goals was economic integration. After 48 years, the ASEAN Economic Community is finally here. Under the present plans, the AEC will be rolled in December this year, under the chairmanship of Malaysia as the ASEAN chair. In today's webcast, we have two prominent economists who will talk about the AEC and Malaysia's role in bringing the AEC into being. Our first guest is Professor Wu In Thye, President of the Jeffrey Chia Institute and Professor of Economics at University of California, Davis. And our second guest is Professor Rajah, Professor of Economics and Technology Management at University Malaya. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to Jeffrey Chia Institute first webcast for 2015. Now, if ASEAN were one economy, as the ASEAN Economic Community intends to be, it will be the 7th largest in the world with a combined GDP of about US $2.4 trillion. With a population of over 600 million people, ASEAN's potential market is larger than that of the European Union and has the world's 3rd largest workforce. Yet there are many in today's world who are deeply skeptical about the AEC and its timeline. So let me start with Professor Rajah. Malaysia is the chair of the ASEAN for this year and obviously will play a key role in ensuring that the AEC will come online at the end of this year. Now, what is your assessment? Has ASEAN country done enough to ensure that AEC will become a reality by December this year?
My feeling is yes, because it depends on how one has defined the community here as opposed to how it's defined in Europe. In Europe, you not only have the European community, but you also have the monetary union. We are certainly not thinking about a monetary union. So in that sense, knowing the ASEAN way, there's a tendency for governments as members of ASEAN not to pursue things whenever there's friction, not to pursue any line whenever there's disagreement. They call it, I think, constructive engagement, to use Surin Pitsuwan's language, who himself was a former ASEAN Secretary General. So I think, by and large, in the context of what they have aimed, they probably, at least on paper, will have the ASEAN Economic Community.
Professor Wu?
I think it's unlikely that they would meet the targets that were set down in the ASEAN Economic Community blueprint that was put out in 2007. But they could point to significant progress towards that goal. In other words, they would emphasize that this is still a work in progress, and because it is on track, there would be agreement that success is within reach.
Well, the thing is, the implementation of the ASEAN Free Trade Area, the common effective tariff rates are now virtually zero for the ASEAN 6. And about 70% of intra-ASEAN trade is actually conducted at what we call the most favored nation status tariff rates. But you know, some of the recent studies done in the last 2 years have shown that the non-tariff barrier is actually growing among ASEAN countries. So how do you reconcile this? On the one hand, tariffs are going down, but non-tariff barriers are going up, and yet you're trying to create AEC at the same time. How do you reconcile these two contradictions?
Therein lies the problem, why I differentiated the European experience with the ASEAN experience. Simply because you would not see serious friction as such just because one country has introduced a non-tariff barrier. It's like some of them are even quantifiable if they are dealing with, say, excise duties over import tariffs, meaning they lower import tariff to 0%, 5% and less, but then they introduce excise duties on something, or something else like having a permit to import something. Those things I think have been around for a while. My understanding of it, that's how I've taken it quite loosely, in the context of how the agreement was signed earlier and in the context of the goals. I feel that one can't possibly expect every one of those lines that they put up there to be achieved by the end of the year. But having said that, I think there will be progress in that direction, not one where they will eventually achieve everything, meaning it's a bit like talking about the US in the WTO, simply because whenever there's a problem, US does raise tariffs sometimes, on steel products, for example. So likewise, I feel that's not how one should conceive this free trade area. Free trade area, I think in the context of how I've seen it manifesting in many parts of the world, should be seen as one that gives you a direction, a target to go to, and then the general baseline is actually observed, meaning that they move towards free trade, and whenever there are problems of some kind, though excuses will be given, like say the protection of protons, for example, they would do these things, but it doesn't necessarily be that only Malaysia would do that. That's the point I'm trying to make. But all I'm saying here is if one is expecting liberalization in the context of removal of non-tariff barriers to be in sync with the quantitative restrictions that they have agreed and by and large removed, then I think we are looking at a situation where you wouldn't possibly achieve those things. But I feel that's not a realistic thing to look at, because countries in the world somehow end up doing these things. So that's why I'm more optimistic looking at what's going on, simply because these countries stand to benefit from greater integration. It's impossible to look at one country lowering and the other not doing, because reciprocation and complementation are all critical parts of appropriating those synergies. That's why I think it's important they do that. But at the same time, most quantitative studies that deal with this, to me, I'm not sure if they are making sense of it, because if you did a study, say, before 92, after agreement, there's a likelihood that you would have had much more liberalization. You would have had even growth rates in FDI in this ASEAN 5, as opposed to 6, where you're including Brunei. You will tend to find that those flows may have been actually higher, may have grown actually that much higher than the period thereafter. I think that sort of comparison sometimes can be misleading. That's one. Second, the base has also become that much bigger. Earlier you had smaller GDPs and so on, so your growth rate would be much more impressive, exciting to look at compared to the subsequent one, because the base is already that much bigger. So once people take into account these things, as far as the final one, I would say it's also inevitable that they do that. In other words, the counterfactual that you will have to look at, the consequences of not doing it would mean causing more injury, economic injury to these economies, as they also face the war, competing with the rest.
Yes, well, I think your answers is very consistent with what many of the supporters are saying. They're saying that the whole idea of AEC is actually a journey rather than simply a target at the end of the year. But what do you think, Professor Wu?
I think this phenomenon of you pointing out that when there is a step forward, there are in many occasions there will at least be half a step backward. So the step forward is the reduction of the tariff rates, and the half step backward would be the increase in non-trade barriers. This phenomena, this hesitance movement, reflect the fact that ASEAN really don't move forward. ASEAN moves forward only when there is a common external threat. Specifically, if you think back of why ASEAN was formed, it was formed initially largely as a national security grouping against the spread of communism. So there was a common external threat, so we got together. But we got together not to promote economic integration, but mainly to promote a common political stance towards the other side of the Cold War. We really started economic integration only because there was a common economic threat to the region that came out in 2000 when China successfully concluded its negotiations with the US to join WTO. Once, when China was on the verge of entering WTO, businesses all over the world recognized that China now has guaranteed access to the US and European markets. So if you were to produce for the US and European markets, there's no longer the need to diversify your base of production. Whenever you invest in China, you put some in Southeast Asia. So if China ever gets unable to get the most favored nation status that year, you service the market from Southeast Asia. So one thing is, once they had guaranteed access, a lot of FDIs that would have come to Southeast Asia went to China. Another reason why the FDI also flow more to China is because by joining WTO, the Chinese would find it harder to put on tariffs. So the access to a larger market is more secure. So there are two reasons. One is they are sure that producing goods in China, you can be sure to be able to sell it in the European markets. And the second thing is China is less likely to prevent foreign goods from being sold in China. So we face the economic threat of reduced FDI flow. The data shows very clearly that in 2001, FDI flows just plummeted. So how do we compete? How do we get our shine back as an FDI destination? One way to get our shine back as an FDI destination is to say our domestic market is as large as that of China. It's not as small as you think. You will be able to produce to an insignificant market, and so that's why we got together and have the first serious effort in economic integration, the ASEAN Economic Community. We will become a sizable market and hence be able to attract FDI to come back. So that was, I think, the development that really pushes into that direction. Now that we've agreed to do it, we have gone quite a distance in reducing tariff rates. We see that we think that we have reaped whatever benefits there could be. That's why we have stopped further efforts in integration. I think, however, the integration, there is now a new external threat. A new external threat that provides a chance for greater ASEAN economic integration. Let me explain what I mean. I predict that there will be greater economic integration and security integration because now that ASEAN face a new common threat. The new common threat provides, if we handle it correctly, it yields very tangible economic benefits. Specifically, there is the revival of the Cold War. Well, the bloodiest form is happening in Ukraine, but the potential bloody form is happening in the Thye Islands, the Senkaku, and then next in the mischief reef of the Philippines, and in the paracel of Vietnam. What we are seeing is really not just rivalry between China and Japan, but it's China and Japan and US on one side, and it's not China and the Philippines, it's China versus the Philippines and the US on one side, and the US is getting much closer to Vietnam, its former enemy. In this situation, what do we see? We see that the Chinese have started the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is basically trying to woo us to their side. And what do we see in the US? We see the pivot to Asia. And there is quite a substantial amount of Japanese aid flowing to Southeast Asia. They are, in a way, trying to sway us to the other side. So it seems this new Cold War is good for us. We get economic benefits from both sides. And especially since the global economy is slowing down now, we have to boost economic growth with infrastructure spending. And both blocs, the Chinese and the Japanese-US bloc, are offering the money. So that is very good. But however, it is naive to think that this can just continue the way it is. All of these economic benefits to ASEAN exists only when the tensions of this new Cold War are low. So they're out to win friends and influence people. If the tensions ever get high, then their attitude is, if you are not with us, you are against us. So ASEAN does not really get to choose its side. Its side gets chosen for ASEAN. So for ASEAN to maintain this flow of economic benefits from both areas, our job is to make sure that these political tensions stay low. How can we make sure it stay low? Here is a thing that Malaysia could do as the chairman of ASEAN this year, which is that Malaysia should mobilize ASEAN as a group to press the two sides of the new Cold War for establishment of a regional mediation mechanism. Because the way the Chinese sees it is, why should we talk to the group? We'll talk to you one by one on specific issues. But that really does not ensure that the tensions between the two sides stay low.
So you don't think that the current ARF mechanism, the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is basically a security dialogue, so you don't think that is playing its role now?
It should be given a more specific form. For example, when countries bring a case up, there will be an arbitration committee set up, and both sides have to have agreed beforehand that they will abide by the arbitration decision.
But you see, a lot of people in ASEAN are arguing that the reason why China doesn't want to do this sort of thing is that in terms of Chinese foreign policy making, they always take the long-term view. So, for example, we know that Code of Conduct dealing with the South China Sea, it took China 10 years to give a simple reply to say that we are actually interested in the Code of Conduct. So, given the fact that the Chinese are playing this in a long-term game, and given that in most parts of Southeast Asia, governments here probably have a 5-year time frame, how do you reconcile these two?
The reason that China might actually be in favor of making a decision now on the regional mediation mechanism is that if the ASEAN were to ask for it, and the US and Japanese I'm pretty sure be in favor of it, they realize that they are pushing ASEAN to the other side. And I think if the existence of this particular mechanism, we will be able to keep the political tensions low enough such that both sides will continue to woo us and help us in our economic development. Now, how can we achieve that consensus among ourselves? We can achieve that consensus among ourselves if Malaysia could persuade Indonesia to make the big sacrifice in the short term of opening its market seriously as an example for the rest of ASEAN to embrace the ASEAN economic community.
And this brings me to my next question. To be a true economic community, you basically need a free or a smooth transfer of goods and services. Yet ASEAN even doesn't have, at the present moment, a common custom window. We know that starting this year, the 5 founding members of ASEAN will do a trial run on a common window. It is the same with labor mobility. We talk about labor mobility, but there's actually no automatic right of labor to move across ASEAN borders. There's also talk about open free skies for many years now. Even today, we don't have open free skies. It seems to me that the hurdles are much more rather than the success. So given the fact that we can't even agree on things like the free sky, labor mobility, common custom windows, how can we actually roll out the AEC at the end of the year?
I think to a large extent, a number of the points that you raised relate to what we refer to as public goods, because the beneficiaries are not those two guys who just spend money on them, like say a common custom window. But I think going back to what Professor Wu mentioned just now, My understanding is Indonesia has liberalized a lot more. The transition between Suharto and Habibie was quite clear in terms of how the bailout took place. It necessitated and it was accompanied by huge amounts of liberalization, such that even the automotive industry, the aeroplane industry, all just completely got wiped out. So my feeling is the example of using Indonesia, which is the largest in terms of population, I think that's important to distinguish, because markets themselves also, you have to refer the effective demand, and Europe would still, I believe, have an advantage over ASEAN. But I think there are certain things that we need to address here. We go back, although I'm not sure if Professor Wing took the same line at the end. He mentioned that we are almost like footballs in this geopolitical game between the camps that he mentioned. I'm not a political scientist, but if that's the case, then I'm not sure, even though we can mobilize ourselves, whether we can have that sort of edge to tell them what to do. But I can mention a few examples here. When the 97-98 crisis took place, if we use examples of crisis as one that bring our members together, it didn't. It actually drove us away. The attempt to get the Singapore dollar as the currency was rejected by the Singaporeans. And then the attempt to have some sort of a common policy as such did not work. Mahathir decided to follow the Keynesian approach of introducing capital controls. Yet again, there was a lot of collaboration too. Even then, they did have. So my feeling is, if one defines things in a very rigid manner, you might produce a Greece. The way the monetary union has gone, in the sense that the extent of flexibility they enjoy is much less, and the way it has been conceived to, with Germany and France largely dominating, even they have a fiscal policy, because countries can have their own non-monetary policy, though they have a common monetary policy. My feeling is it had created that sort of rigidities. I think Stiglitz takes this point too. So I feel that in as much as there are areas where they could actually cooperate a lot more and see that the noble goals of liberalization takes place, but not in the context of completely removing subsidies, because I still believe they are relevant for supporting technological catch-up. I prefer that over, say, having tariffs there. But I'd like to mention that when you're dealing with FDI is seen as not necessarily as a panacea. If you look at Korea and Taiwan, the shares of FDI in equity markets are much higher now than it was, say, during the time these countries actually grew rapidly. Now, my feeling is, we, for example, Malaysia, we use Malaysia as an example, we have largely slowed down. I even refer to the kind of industrialization we have to premature deindustrialization. Simply because before we matured, before we actually reached the high levels of seeing firms reach a frontier, I mean, we have Malaysians but abroad though. Wah Kian Singh, for example, is at the frontier doing pen drives and so on in Taiwan, but we don't have them here. Now, unless we do these things, we no longer actually enjoy the labor endowments to attract low-end activities. In clothing, we are here, but we rely on foreign workers. There are enough papers to say that the lion's share of workers that we use are actually foreign workers. Even then, value added in that industry is actually falling slowly. In electronics, again, that's why I'm not comfortable with those guys who work on fragmentation. The initial guy whom I really respect doing this was actually Helena in 74. He has this article in the Economic Journal where he talks about differentiation of production and what benefits it brings to all these poor countries. But what I think didn't happen is, it's like now, Ricardo Hausmann is trying to do this. If you look at in the last 5 years, there has been a big shift in the exports of electronic goods from Malaysia to the US. It's really largely going to China now. Now, what are we exporting to China? Mainly fabricated wafers, chips, and so on. My understanding of it is, when one looks at markets, the ASEAN 5 are largely export-oriented economies. Much of their GDP, if you look at the share, although exports is gross figure, and imports together, even Malaysia will exceed the GDP. Singapore is even higher because they also have re-exports. So my feeling is, I would like to look at the fact that we have played important roles, largely on the back of export markets. These ASEAN 5 actually have grown. Indonesia may be less, but still not comparable to the sort of, even China has much less export intensity of GDP than any of these countries. So my feeling is, if we are losing competitiveness in that sort of fields, I would like to come back to say that that's simply because we have not done what we need to do to stimulate upgrading. Meaning, we did not work on to produce the human capital necessary to promote upgrading. Also, we didn't work on the institutions sufficiently well, and to me, that's a consequence of ethnic policies we've had, manifestation of political parties by ethnic groups. So you can't possibly have, say, MIMOS run by the former CEO of Kimonda, a Malaysian Chinese, who was very aggressive, very successful. You couldn't bring him back like Wu Taiwan or Maurice Chang and so on, because tacit knowledge is important, experiential knowledge is important. They bring networks back, and you lead to a different segment before you actually orchestrate strategies to move up. We didn't take that, and we need to do that in order to contain or retain the interest in FDI, because FDI is not going to come here to go and do all those low-end activities. There are many parts of China, science parks in particular, in Shenzhen and so on, they have higher value-added activities going there than what we are doing here. So my feeling is, these are all strategies that go with individual countries. It's like we have LDCs as our members, they enjoy preferential access to EU, everything but arms clause, or the bilateral agreement with the US. Now, I think those windows come here and there. We can't possibly extend that to a common ASEAN window as such. We should actually take advantage of those things. And where possible, this idea that Professor Wing raised just now may be interesting to explore, to see whether they can actually mobilize to negotiate with China. But remember the case with TPPA. The US excluded China in its initial negotiations. To a large extent, even Krugman is seeming to sound like that now, that it was an agenda against China. So my feeling is, again, fine, it is still consistent with the template that Professor Wing presented just now, the geopolitics of tensions between big powers over there. But what influence really ASEAN members as a team will have? That's the sort of question I pose back, because there hasn't been one where you have overly extensive excitement by the two big powers, especially the US. The US has always negotiated one by one. It has never gone multilaterally to discuss things. I'd like to throw that back.
Sure. Well, it seems to me that for most people, at least, for AEC to succeed, it's obvious that coming back to the issue of institutions, you need a strong institution to pull all these countries together. Yeah. Yet we know that the ASEAN Secretariat, by world standards, is extremely small. In fact, the budget is only 16 million a year, or even less. So how do you expect the AEC to come online with such a small institution that is supposed to do some level of coordination work among all the 10 ASEAN countries? Professor Wu?
Your question and what Rajah just now said about why Malaysia is unable to adjust well to integration efforts, because Malaysia is not able to upgrade itself easily because of Malaysia's ethnic policies. Here, what he has done is to have brought a very fundamental point. The reason why ASEAN is so slow to integrate is a reflection of that in some of the major countries in the region. There's a failure to integrate even within its own borders. So given the fact that there's no acceptance of people within people who are different than you in some ways within your own borders, how could there be easy acceptance of people who are from outside of your borders? That is the fundamental reason why there's no natural common cultural values that we could appeal to drive forward together. That explains what Rajah says, that I had claimed that ASEAN moves together as a group when there's a common external threat. He presented a very good counter example of what the Asian financial crisis. It hit them all, and what did they do? They even refused to help each other, like Singapore for Indonesia. I like to suggest that the initial response to common foreign threats, common outside threat, is usually one of disarray, which reflects the fact that you cannot accept people who are different from you, whether inside your own borders or outside your own borders. But after the initial panic is over, more rational, cooler minds prevail, and that is when the forward integration appears. For example, what are the long-term outcome of the Asian financial crisis? During the crisis itself, there was not much coordination, no group help, like Singapore denying help to Indonesia. But what was the long term? The long term is we have established the Chiang Mai Initiative, we have established various ASEAN plus 3. In other words, the cooler minds prevail in that even though we viscerally not comfortable with people who are different than us, racially, culturally, religiously, whatever, we see the gains in working together. So that is why I see that the counter-example that Rajah said was really, what it means is the initial response is not always in the right step, but ultimately cooler minds prevail and say, let us overcome this instinctive avoidance of different types of people, but we go for the common goal. And here in the case of Indonesia, that was raised very well just now, about Indonesia has done much more liberalization than before. You could say Indonesia has always been liberal throughout the time, in fact, in goods, because of smuggling. Indonesia is a country of 100,000 islands, and there's so much smuggling that Singapore refuses to publish the data of bilateral trade with Indonesia. Because if Singapore were to ever review how much goods is coming from Indonesia, it will greatly exceed what the Indonesian data is of goods coming to Indonesia, similarly on export. So when the Indonesian liberalized, basically they were just bringing in to the open what exists in fact in the black markets. But where Indonesia really needs to move would be in services. This, you could say, in ownership, local resource requirement, in output. And why is Indonesia so hesitant? It suffers from what Rajah has just said, that these countries are unable to upgrade themselves. They open up and then they get some industries taken away, but no new ones seem to emerge. Very very slow responsiveness. And that, in the case of Indonesia, is due to low education, and in the case of Malaysia, due to its ethnic policies, is a low supply responsiveness. The low supply responsiveness in all these countries make them less willing to integrate because it will require adjustments in the economies.
Well, thank you very much. Finally, if you were in a position to advise the Malaysian government on the AEC, in 1 minute, what are the 3 key items you want the Malaysian government to do to ensure that the AEC will be raw in December?
Well, I think within Malaysia, we would certainly be able to try to show an example in terms of cutting back on our own non-tariff barriers, cutting back on restrictions of investment based on non-economic criteria like national origin, racial origin, and so forth. But I think that the most important thing that the Malaysian could do is to help persuade Indonesia to lead the mobilization of ASEAN to push for the establishment of a regional mediation mechanism, keeping the Cold War tensions low in East Asia, and hence allowing us to receive maximum economic benefits from both sides of the Cold War.
Professor Rajah?
The first is to see that they indeed make it serious that the goals that were established during the agreement are achieved, or at least there's a serious effort to achieve them. And in doing that, they have to be highly diplomatic in trying to bring across that sort of achievement. The second one, I believe they will have to coordinate labor markets and what happens to the environment. The environment has a lot to do with public goods too. It's just like, if only they can come up with some sort of deal across the straits of Malacca, you can stop the haze from coming. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand. Not everybody, that's a public good.
Everybody benefits, yeah.
So, I mean, that sort of cooperation should be there. That sort of cooperation should be there. And it can also be done through the regional value, regional integration, through how multinationals or regional multinationals themselves are integrated at different levels. Both environment and labor, I'm looking at. Labor too, it's pointless looking at too many people in certain countries existing in informal markets. Philippines and Indonesia have lots of informal workers, Thailand too, even though Thailand is only slightly less developed than us in per capita terms. So I think they have to try to do something about that. The more the informal markets you have, not only you don't track the clearing wage against unemployment, you also don't really monitor what's happening to them. And it can actually distort many things, even in the wrong sense. And then that could be the basis of convincing the other CMLV countries that this is the right way to go. Of course, there must be an attempt to provide assistance too, if they can do that. The last point out of the three that you allowed us to speak on is on services. And in here, I think there must be really strong initiatives to build infrastructure to allow for more free movement of people. In my understanding of this, from the way I've grown, the more interaction we have, the more likely that with the same sort of brain you have, you will have a better brain. Much more exchange you have. It's like going to Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby against going to the hinterland. You see vast difference. Or even if you go to Nigeria, if you are in Lagos, even though it can be risky, or Ikeja, and you go to Abuja, you meet the fellas who are local there, not the ministers and so on. I think there's a vast difference in the way people filter information and so on. So to me, both physical infrastructure and through internet and so on, that should be extended as much as they can, so that there's free movement of knowledge, which also helps with the process of systemic flows of knowledge that help technological upgrading, brain circulation.
Let me add to what Rajah has just said. I second that proposal greatly. Specifically, what Malaysia could introduce as a region-wide initiative that would benefit everybody is the establishment of what is the Galileo system of education in the European Union. Basically, they harmonize the education standard at a high level, and they promote the synergy of the talented people in their country. But the establishment of such a Galileo system in ASEAN would require that we recognize that we have to use a language in which everyone is comfortable with. So just like English is the official language of ASEAN as a group, we should make English the language of education in the region, as much as the governments could manage that politically at home. Because number one, that will increase academic standards and general knowledge, which would help people to adjust to changes introduced by ASEAN, by AEC and other future global developments. So yes, I think Najib should be the education leader for ASEAN, is my recommendation.
And with that, thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.